The water buffalo stopped walking. Nguyen Van Hai, 61 years old, had worked that same paddy outside the village of Tam Bin for 34 years. And in all that time, the animal had never simply refused to move. The plow had snagged on something. Hai bent down into the warm brown water, felt around in the muck with his calloused fingers, and pulled up 2 flat pieces of stamped metal connected by a beaded chain. He wiped them on his shirt. The letters were in English. He could not read them, but he had lived long enough in the Mekong Delta to know exactly what they were. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment and tell us. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel with a subscription. It was a morning in late March of 2005. The dry season was ending, and the paddies of Vinh Long province were being prepared for the first planting. The air smelled of wet clay and wood smoke from the cooking fires of the village. Somewhere a transistor radio was playing Vietnamese pop music, tinny and distorted. Hai stood in the water with the dog tags dangling from his hand and looked across the flat green expanse of the delta, at the line of coconut palms in the distance, at the white sky pressing down on everything, and he felt something cold move through his chest. He had been a boy of 23 when the war ended. He had seen things sink into these paddies that were never meant to be found again. He carried the tags home to his wife. She took one look at them and told him to bring them to the village committee. The committee chairman, a former North Vietnamese army sergeant named Tran, sat at his metal desk under a slowly turning ceiling fan and read the names aloud in halting English. Thibodaux, Roy J. Lieutenant, United States Air Force, service number partially worn, blood type O positive, Catholic. Within 72 hours, the information had moved through 3 Vietnamese government offices and arrived at the United States Embassy in Hanoi, where it was forwarded to the Defense Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Agency at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii. The case officer who opened the file was a 47-year-old retired Air Force investigator named Dale Murchison, brought back on contract because he had spent 11 years working recovery cases in Southeast Asia and knew the terrain better than almost anyone. He read the cable, set down his coffee, and pulled the master file on Lieutenant Roy Thibodaux from the archive. The folder was thin. Thibodaux had been listed as missing in action for 38 years. According to the official record, his A-1H Skyraider had gone down during a close air support mission in the spring of 1967. The aircraft was reported to have crashed into the Co Chien River, a tributary of the Mekong, and was presumed lost in deep water and strong current. No remains had ever been recovered, no wreckage had ever been located. The case had been quietly downgraded from active to deferred in 1973 and had not been touched since. Murchison spread a topographic map across his desk and marked 2 points with a red grease pencil. The first was the reported loss location, derived from the wingman's debriefing in 1967. The second was the rice paddy outside Tam Bin village, where the dog tags had surfaced. He measured the distance between them with a piece of string. 14 kilometers, almost 9 miles. In a straight line, across a stretch of delta that was crisscrossed by canals, paddies, and dense vegetation, but nowhere near the river where the aircraft was supposed to have gone down. He sat back in his chair. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside the window, a C-17 was rolling onto the runway at Hickam, its engines spooling up with a low metallic whine. Murchison had spent enough years on these cases to know that dog tags do not travel 14 kilometers from a crash site by themselves. They do not float upstream. They do not get carried inland by birds or buffalo. If Roy Thibodaux's tags were in that paddy, then Roy Thibodaux had been in that paddy. And if Roy Thibodaux had been in that paddy, then the official report on his loss was wrong. He picked up the phone and called the recovery team coordinator in Hanoi. He told her he wanted boots on the ground in Vinh Long within 10 days. She asked him what he expected to find. Murchison looked at the map. at the red mark, 14 kilometers from where a man was supposed to have died. And he said something he would later wish he had not. He said he had no idea, but whatever it was, somebody had spent 38 years making sure nobody went looking for it. The cable from the embassy in Hanoi arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday morning, Dale Murchison had read every page of the Thibodaux file 3 times, and 3 times he had stopped at the same line in the wingman's debriefing and felt the small, cold thing in his chest get a little colder. The line read, "Subject aircraft last observed in controlled descent, intact, on heading 270. Pilot reported engine smooth. No further transmissions." Murchison underlined it in pencil. Then he underlined it again. In 30 years of investigating aircraft losses, he had read perhaps 4,000 wingman debriefings. They followed a pattern. When an aircraft was lost in combat, the surviving pilot reported what he had seen with the hyper-precise vocabulary of men who had been trained to describe disasters. Aircraft impacted terrain in nose-down attitude. Aircraft observed to break up at altitude. Aircraft entered cloud and was not seen again. The phrasing was standardized because the consequences of imprecision were enormous. Families would be notified. Pensions would be paid or denied. Search efforts would be allocated based on the precise words a frightened young man used in a debriefing room 12 hours after watching his friend die. Controlled descent. Intact. Engine smooth. No further transmissions. That was not a description of an aircraft going into a river. That was a description of an aircraft making an emergency landing. And then, nothing. No mayday, no follow-up, no sighting of a parachute, no sighting of impact. Just silence on the radio, and a Skyraider disappearing into the green checkerboard of the Mekong Delta. Murchison made a list of the questions that the original investigators should have asked and apparently had not. Why no mayday call if the engine was running smooth? Why was the aircraft on a heading of 270 due west when its assigned target area was to the southeast? Why had the wingman, a young captain named Curtis Weems, been allowed to file his report and rotate home within 3 weeks of the loss, when standard practice in 1967 was to keep witnesses available for follow-up questioning? And why had the case been so aggressively shelved? Most missing in action files from Southeast Asia stayed open for decades, picking up new information from refugee debriefings, prisoner exchanges, satellite reconnaissance. The Thibodaux file had gone dark in '73 and stayed dark. He pulled the personnel jacket on Roy Thibodaux next. The man came together in pieces of paper, born in Houma, Louisiana in the fall of 1941. Cajun French as a first language, English learned in school. Father a shrimp boat captain in Terrebonne Parish, mother a school teacher. 2 sisters, 1 older, 1 younger. Graduated from Louisiana State University with a degree in mechanical engineering in the spring of 1963. Commissioned through Air Force ROTC. Pilot training at Reese Air Force Base in Texas. Initial assignment to F-100s at England Air Force Base in Alexandria, Louisiana. Volunteered for A-1 Skyraider training in 1966 and shipped to Vietnam that fall. The Skyraider was an old aircraft by then, a propeller-driven attack plane designed in the last months of the Second World War. It had been replaced in most frontline roles by jets, but its enormous payload capacity, long loiter time, and ability to absorb ground fire had made it indispensable for close air support and combat search and rescue. The men who flew them called themselves SPADs, after the First World War fighter, and they were a particular breed. They flew low. They flew slow. They flew in weather that would ground the jets, and they came home with holes you could put your fist through. Thibodaux had been assigned to the 1st Special Operations Squadron, based at Pleiku in the Central Highlands, but operating throughout South Vietnam and, occasionally, in places that did not officially exist. Murchison underlined that last part in his notes too. He spent the rest of the day on the phone, He called the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell. He called the Record Center in St. Louis. He called 2 old friends at the Central Intelligence Agency's History Office. By 5 in the afternoon, he had confirmed what he had suspected. The mission Thibodaux had flown on the day he disappeared was not in any of the squadron's published mission logs. The frag order had been issued verbally. The target coordinates had been provided by a liaison officer whose name was redacted in every document Murchison could access. And the post-mission paperwork, the after-action report, that should have run to 12 or 15 pages, was 4 pages long, with pages 3 through 7 listed as missing from the file. Pages 3 through 7, missing. Not destroyed, not classified, not withheld. Missing. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window. The sun was setting over the harbor. A pair of F-22s were taxiing back to the ramp, their canopies catching the last orange light. Somewhere on a base in Texas, an old man named Curtis Weems was probably eating dinner. Somewhere in a graveyard in Louisiana, an empty plot bore the name Roy Thibodaux. And somewhere in a rice paddy in Vinh Long Province, the answers had been sitting in the mud for 38 years, waiting for a water buffalo to refuse to take another step. Murchison drove home that night and could not sleep. He kept seeing the same image. A young pilot, alone in a cockpit, riding a Skyraider down through the heavy Delta air, the engine still turning over smooth, the controls still answering. A green field rushing up to meet him. And waiting somewhere in that field, in the heat and the mud and the silence, something that was not the enemy. The recording ran 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Murchison would listen to it more times than he could count over the next year. It was the cockpit voice transmission from Curtis Weems on the morning Roy Thibodaux disappeared, recovered from a tape archive at the Air Force Historical Research Agency in the spring of 2005. The tape was scratchy, thin with age, and there was a moment near the end where Weems said something that had been transcribed into the official report as unintelligible. Murchison had a forensic audio specialist clean it up. What Weems actually said was, "Hobo 2, who is that on your ramp? Repeat, who is the second man?" Nobody of the squadron had ever asked who the second man was. The morning Thibodaux flew his last mission, the runway at Bien Hoa was already shimmering with heat by 0600. The dry season was holding on past its time, and the air over the Mekong Delta had that flat metallic taste it took on when the monsoon was still weeks away. 2 A-1H Skyraiders sat on the apron with their canopies open, their Wright R3350 radial engines ticking as the ground crews finished the pre-flight inspections. The smell was unmistakable to anyone who had been around piston engine warbirds. Hot oil, 115-octane avgas, the slightly burned sweetness of exhaust still cooling from the previous sortie. Each Skyraider was loaded with a mixed payload: 500-pound bombs on the inboard stations, napalm canisters on the outboards, and a full load of 20mm cannon ammunition for the 4 wing guns. Roy Thibodaux walked the line of his aircraft one last time. He was 25 years old, 6 feet tall, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with the wiry build of a man who had grown up working on shrimp boats in the salt marshes south of Homa. He wore a faded green flight suit, scuffed black boots, a survival vest with a .38 caliber revolver in a shoulder holster, and a pair of dog tags around his neck that his older sister Marie had blessed at the cathedral in Thibodauxville before he shipped out. He had been in country 7 months. He had flown 93 combat missions. He was scheduled to rotate home in 4 weeks. His wingman that morning was Captain Curtis Weems of Macon, Georgia, 3 years older, 2 years more experienced, and quiet to the point of being mistaken for unfriendly by men who did not know him. Weems had grown up hunting deer in the pine woods of central Georgia and had transferred to the A-1 community after a tour on F-105s in which he had been shot down once over Laos and walked out. He did not talk about it. He flew in Thibodaux's wing and watched his friend's tail and read paperback westerns in the ready room between missions. Louis L'Amour mostly. The squadron called the two of them the Cajun and the Cracker, and they had been flying together for 6 months. The mission brief that morning was short and strange. The squadron operations officer, a major whose name does not appear in any of the unredacted documents, told them they would be supporting a small ground element in Vinh Long province. There was no friendly unit designation given. There was no forward air controller assigned. Their initial point would be a bend in the Co Chien River, after which they would receive target coordinates from a ground party using the call sign Cottonmouth. Weems asked who Cottonmouth was. The major said that was need to know, and they did not need to know. Thibodaux did not ask anything. He nodded, drank the rest of his coffee, and walked out to his airplane. What happened next exists only in fragments. The two Skyraiders departed Bien Hoa at 06:47 and flew southwest across the alluvial plain of the Mekong Delta at 1,500 feet. The morning haze was thick. Visibility was 3 to 4 miles. They reached the Co Chien River initial point at 07:31 and began circling. Weems would later testify that they orbited for almost 40 minutes before any contact was made. When the contact came, it was not on the assigned frequency. A voice came up on guard channel, the universal emergency frequency that every aircraft monitored, and identified itself as Cottonmouth 6. The voice gave a set of grid coordinates and a brief target description. Small structure, tree line, single target, no friendlies within 500 meters. Weems wrote the coordinates on his kneeboard. Thibodaux acknowledged. They rolled in from the north at 2,000 feet. Thibodaux led. Weems followed in a high-cover orbit. Thibodaux made one pass and dropped 2 500-pound bombs. The structure, whatever it was, disappeared in a column of black smoke and red delta mud. He pulled off the target and climbed back to altitude. Weems was about to begin his own run when Thibodaux's voice came up on the radio, calm and conversational. "Hobo 1, this is Hobo 2. I think I picked up some small arms on that pass. I'm losing oil pressure. Going to set her down in the paddy." Weems looked down. He could see Thibodaux's Skyraider trailing a thin line of gray smoke. The aircraft was descending in a smooth, controlled glide, gear up, flaps partially extended, headed for a long, unbroken stretch of rice paddy west of the target. Thibodaux greased it in. The Skyraider hit the water, threw up an enormous wall of brown spray, slid for perhaps 400 feet, and came to rest tilted slightly to one side, its propeller bent backward, its canopy still closed but apparently intact. Weems began his orbit. He keyed his microphone. "Hobo 2, you good?" There was no answer. Weems orbited for 46 minutes. He called for combat search and rescue on 3 different frequencies. He saw no movement at the crash site. He saw no fire. And then, exactly 4 minutes before the rescue helicopters arrived, he saw something that he would not put in his official debriefing and would not speak about for 38 years. He saw a man walking away from the Skyraider through the rice paddy, headed west, carrying something over his shoulder. The man was not Roy Thibodaux. Thibodaux had been wearing a green flight suit. This man was wearing black. That was when Weems keyed his microphone and asked, on the open frequency that the entire squadron monitored, "Who is the second man?" Nobody answered. And by the time the rescue helicopters arrived overhead, the second man was gone. The team's initial report was filed by hand in a notebook, in pencil, because the recovery site was so deep in the delta that battery-powered equipment could not be relied upon. The first entry, dated the second week of April 2005, read, "Site located. Wreckage confirmed at depth 1.5 meters. Engine intact. Cockpit intact. Remains present. Recommend full archaeological recovery protocol. Anomalies noted, see attached." The attached anomalies ran to 4 pages. The recovery team that arrived at the rice paddy outside Tam Bin consisted of 14 people. 4 were American forensic specialists from the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency. 6 were Vietnamese government archaeologists. The rest were laborers hired locally to handle the manual work of pumping the paddy dry, building dikes around the recovery site, and sifting the soil through fine wire screens. The site was set up in the standard grid pattern, with stakes and string laid out in 1-meter squares, and every object recovered was bagged, tagged, and photographed before being moved. Dale Murchison flew in from Hawaii on the 3rd day. He arrived in Ho Chi Minh City on a commercial flight, drove south through the night in a rented Toyota Land Cruiser, and reached the site at first light. The drive took him past sugarcane fields, past floating markets just beginning to set up on the canals, past Buddhist pagodas with incense smoke curling up from their courtyards. He had not been back to Vietnam in 9 years. The country had changed in ways he did not expect. The roads were paved now. There were billboards in English. But the smell of the Delta, that mixture of damp clay, decomposing vegetation, and wood smoke, was exactly as he remembered it from the rotation he had spent there as a young Air Force enlisted man in 1970. The forensic anthropologist in charge of the dig was a man named Glenn Hargrove, 54 years old, formerly of the Smithsonian, a slow-talking Virginian with a gray beard and a habit of speaking in such complete sentences that men sometimes mistook him for pretentious until they realized he was simply careful. Hargrove met Murchison at the edge of the dike and walked him out to the recovery site through 6 inches of standing water. The sun was just clearing the line of palms to the east. The water was warm. Mosquitoes hung in the air in slow clouds. The wreckage was laid out on tarps under a canvas tent. Hargrove had organized it the way a museum curator would organize an exhibit: forward fuselage, center fuselage, aft fuselage, left wing, right wing, tail. The Wright R3350 engine sat on its own pallet, 18 cylinders of cast aluminum and steel, dirty but recognizable. The propeller, what was left of it, lay beside the engine. 2 of the 4 blades were bent backward at almost 90-degree angles, consistent with a forced landing in soft terrain. The 3rd blade was missing. The 4th was relatively straight, suggesting the engine had been turning slowly or not at all at the moment of impact. That was the first anomaly. A Skyraider with a smooth-running engine and a controlled descent should have come down with all 4 propeller blades bent uniformly. Thibodaux had reported losing oil pressure, but had not reported an engine failure, and Weems had described seeing only thin smoke and a normal glide. Yet the propeller damage suggested the engine had been at idle or stopped at the moment of impact. The second anomaly was the cockpit. The canopy was found in 3 pieces, 2 of them still attached to the rails, the 3rd lying 12 feet from the wreckage. The latches were intact. The canopy had not been blown off by a crash impact, nor had it been ejected by the pilot. It had been opened, manually, from the inside or the outside. Then it had been removed. The 3rd anomaly was the seatbelt. It was unfastened. Roy Thibodaux had been belted into a Skyraider cockpit when he made his descent, and a man does not unfasten his seatbelt while he is dying. Glenn Hargrove walked Murchison around the layout, pointing at items with the eraser end of a pencil. He spoke without hurry. He explained that the human remains in the cockpit were almost certainly those of Lieutenant Thibodaux. The dental work was consistent with the dental records on file. The skeletal dimensions were consistent with the height and build noted in the personnel jacket. The blood type, where determinable from bone marrow residue, was O positive. The DNA samples had been sent to the laboratory at Dover Air Force Base for confirmation, but the preliminary identification was solid. There was no bullet damage to the bones. There was no blunt trauma. There was no evidence of fire. Murchison asked how Thibodaux had died. Hargrove said he could not yet say. The cause of death was not obvious from the skeletal evidence alone. It was possible Thibodaux had drowned. It was possible he had suffocated. It was possible he had simply been left in the cockpit, injured until he expired. The remains had been undisturbed for 38 years, sealed in the anaerobic mud of the paddy, which had preserved the bones in remarkable condition, but had also destroyed any soft tissue that might have offered a definitive answer. Then Hargrove pointed at something on a separate tarp. 2 short lengths of metal tubing, cleanly severed, the ends bright and sharp. Those, he said, were the fuel lines from the main wing tank to the engine. They had been cut, not torn, not broken, not melted. Cut, with a blade. Probably a heavy-duty one, possibly bayonet grade. The cuts were too clean to have happened in a crash and too localized to have been caused by ground fire. Murchison stared at the severed lines for a long time. He could feel the sweat running down inside his collar. The mosquitoes were finding the back of his neck. Somewhere out beyond the dike, a water buffalo was making the long, mournful sound that water buffalo make in the morning. Hargrove cleared his throat. There was something else, he said. They had found something at the edge of the recovery grid 2 days earlier that he had not yet entered into the official log because he wanted Murchison to see it first. He led him across the paddy to a smaller tarp at the western edge of the site. He pulled it back. Underneath, laid out in the rough anatomical position in which it had been discovered, was a second human skeleton. The dog tags around the second skeleton's neck read, Harlan, MT. Service number, all zeros. Blood type, B negative. Religion, blank. The chain was steel rather than the standard issue ball chain, and the tags themselves were stamped on slightly heavier metal than the standard military issue. Glenn Hargrove had noticed both anomalies on the first night and had photographed them under raking light to bring out the detail. They looked, he told Murchison, like they had been made by somebody who knew exactly what military dog tags were supposed to look like, but who did not have access to actual military stamping equipment. In other words, they were good fakes. Murchison spent the next 3 days on the satellite phone in the project's command tent, running the name M.T. Harlan through every personnel database he could access. He started with the Air Force because the dog tags were styled like Air Force issue. No record. He tried the Army. No record. The Navy. No record. The Marine Corps. No record. He pulled in a contact at the Defense Manpower Data Center and ran the name against the master roster of every American who had served in any branch between 1960 and 1975. 3 Harlans came up with M middle initials. None of them had a T as a second initial. None of them had blood type B negative. None of them had been anywhere near Vietnam in the spring of 1967. He called his old friend at the CIA's history office. The friend put down the phone, came back 20 minutes later, and said the name was not in the agency's personnel records either. He also said that if M.T. Harlan had been a CIA contract employee, his records would not necessarily be in the personnel database, and that further inquiry would have to go through formal channels. Murchison said he understood. He filed the formal inquiry that afternoon. He did not expect a useful answer, and he did not get one. Meanwhile, Hargrove was doing forensic work on the second skeleton. The findings were unusual. The bones were those of a Caucasian male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, weight in life probably around 170 pounds, age at death between 30 and 40. There was old healed trauma to the ribs, consistent with someone who had been in a vehicle collision or a fall from height years before death. There were healed fractures on the left ulna and the right tibia, neither of which corresponded to any pattern Hargrove associated with combat injuries. The dental work was excellent, suggesting a man with access to good civilian dentistry, but every filling had been ground down or replaced in a way that obscured any potentially identifying characteristics. There were no fillings using materials specific to American military dentistry. There were no fillings using materials specific to any particular national dental tradition. Whoever this man was, somebody had gone to a great deal of trouble to make him difficult to identify. The cause of death, in his case, was not ambiguous at all. There was a single bullet hole through the back of the skull, low, near the base, exiting through the right temple. The angle was downward and slightly forward. It was the kind of wound a man received when he was kneeling and someone was standing behind him. Hargrove did not say the word execution out loud. He did not need to. But it was the location of the body that was the real anomaly. The second skeleton had not been found in the cockpit. It had not been found near the cockpit. It had been found 19 meters west of the wreckage, in what would have been, in the spring of 1967, the next paddy over from the one where the Skyraider came to rest. The body had been buried, shallowly, perhaps 12 to 18 inches deep, in the mud at the base of an earthen dike. It had been there long enough for the dike to be rebuilt over it several times by farmers who had no idea what was underneath. The dog tags had been placed on the chest. The wrists had been bound, in life, with what appeared to be a length of nylon parachute cord, fragments of which were still present. Murchison sat in the command tent that evening and tried to put the picture together. The Skyraider had come down intact. The pilot had been alive when it landed. There had been a second man on board, riding somehow in the cramped Skyraider cockpit, possibly in the small storage area behind the seat, possibly on the wing, possibly strapped to the external rack where additional fuel tanks were sometimes carried. That man had been Caucasian, American-looking, carrying false dog tags with the name Harlan. He had walked away from the wreckage in the minutes after landing. He had been seen by Curtis Weems from the air, walking west, carrying something. And then, at some point before the rescue helicopters arrived, he had been intercepted, bound, marched a short distance, and shot in the back of the head, buried in the mud, forgotten. But Curtis Weems had seen a man walking, alive and unbound, away from the crash site, which meant that whoever killed the second man had to have been waiting for him. They had to have known he was coming. They had to have been in position before the Skyraider ever landed. Which meant that the entire mission, the verbal frag order, the unidentified cottonmouth on the radio, the target coordinates that put 2 A-1Hs over an empty rice paddy in Vinh Long Province, the mysterious second passenger riding in a single-seat attack aircraft, had been a setup. And Roy Thibodaux had been part of it, or had been used to deliver it, or had stumbled into the middle of it and been killed because he saw what he was not supposed to see. Murchison stepped out of the command tent and lit a cigarette. He had quit smoking 3 years earlier and had not had a cigarette in 17 months. He had bought a pack of Vietnamese 5.55s in Ho Chi Minh City on a sudden impulse before the drive south. Now he smoked one slowly in the dark, listening to the frogs in the paddies, watching the heat lightning in the western sky. There was a fundamental question he could no longer avoid. Who had been waiting for the second man at the crash site? The Viet Cong did not execute their prisoners with a single round to the back of the head and leave the body buried in a friendly farmer's dike. They tied them up and marched them off and held them for propaganda or for trade. The North Vietnamese Army, when they did execute prisoners, did so publicly and on their own ground, not in the rice paddies of an unfriendly southern province. South Vietnamese government forces did not execute Caucasian men. American forces did not execute their own. Whoever had been waiting in that paddy on that morning had not been any of the 4 armies that were officially fighting that war. And there was something else. The fuel lines on the Skyraider had been cut, after landing, by someone with access to the engine compartment. The aircraft had been disabled on the ground, not in the air, which meant that whoever killed the second man had also intended that the Skyraider not be flown out, that the wreckage be discovered, that Roy Thibodaux himself never leave that paddy alive. Murchison ground out his cigarette in the wet earth and stared into the dark. He had been doing this work for 30 years. He had cracked cases that had been cold for decades. He had stood on jungle hillsides in Laos and on coral atolls in the Pacific and in the snowfields of the Aleutians, and he had brought home men whose families had given up on them. He had thought he understood what could be hidden in a war. He had been wrong. Somewhere out there, in a small town in Texas, a 75-year-old man named Curtis Weems knew exactly what had happened that morning, and had known for 38 years. The transcript of the interview, as later filed in the partially redacted DPAA case summary, opens with this exchange. Investigator Murchison: Captain Weems, do you understand that this conversation is being recorded? Weems: Yes, sir. Murchison: And you have agreed to speak with me voluntarily? Weems: I have been waiting 38 years for somebody to ask me about this. So yes, voluntarily is the right word. Curtis Weems lived alone in a small ranch house on the western edge of Beaumont, Texas, in a neighborhood of refinery workers and retired schoolteachers. He was 75 years old. He walked with a limp from a knee replacement. His wife had died of cancer 11 years before. His 2 children lived in Dallas and Atlanta and called him on Sundays. He spent his days in his garage workshop, restoring an old Ford pickup truck that had belonged to his father. There was a framed photograph of an A-1 Skyraider on the wall above the workbench. Murchison flew into Houston on a humid Thursday in early summer of 2005 and drove east on Interstate 10 through the petrochemical haze of the Gulf Coast. The smell of refineries hung over everything, that thick, sulfurous reek that men who grew up in those towns barely noticed and visitors could never quite forget. He arrived at the Weems house at 3 in the afternoon. Weems was waiting on the porch with a pitcher of iced tea. They sat in the kitchen for almost 6 hours. The recording device sat on the formica table between them. A wall clock ticked. Outside, a neighbor was running a leaf blower, and a freight train was passing somewhere to the south, its horn drawing the long, mournful note that all Texas freight trains seemed to draw. Weems talked. Murchison listened. The mission that morning had not been a mistake. It had been, Weems said, a delivery. He had not known that at the time. He had been told, like Thibodaux, that they were flying close air support for a small ground element, and like Thibodaux, he had not asked questions when the orders were vague. The 2 of them had been flying together long enough that they trusted the system. The system had let them down. The man riding in Thibodaux's airplane had not been on the manifest. There had been no manifest. The man had been put aboard the Skyraider some time before dawn in a hangar at the far end of the Bien Hoa flight line that the maintenance crews referred to as the spook shed. Weems had not seen him board. He had only learned about him later. Thibodaux had not told him in advance, because Thibodaux had been told not to. The man had been small, Weems said, perhaps 5'8", perhaps 5'9", and he had ridden behind the seat in a compartment that on most Skyraiders held survival gear and ammunition for the wing guns. The compartment had been hastily modified. It would have been a brutal ride. 2 hours in the dark, in a cramped metal box, breathing exhaust fumes, listening to the engine pound a few feet away. Weems took a long drink of his iced tea. He set the glass down very carefully, as if it were full of something more dangerous than tea. He told Murchison that the man's name had been Marcus Theodore Harlan, or so he had been told later, and that he had been an asset, the word the agency had used at the time, who had been brought in from a covert operation conducted in the western part of the Delta. The operation, Weems said, did not have a name that he was aware of in 1967. He had heard a code name mentioned much later by a contact who had retired from the agency in the 1980s. The code name had been Project Driftwood. Murchison wrote the name down, Project Driftwood. Project Driftwood was not in any database he had been able to access. Weems explained that the mission Thibodaux had flown that morning had been a kind of extraction. The 500-pound bombs and the napalm had been cover. The actual purpose had been to land Harlan in a specific paddy in Vinh Long province, where a contact would meet him and move him north along an exfiltration route that ran through Cambodia and back to Saigon by overland transport. The bombing of the structure in the tree line had been intended to provide both noise cover and a plausible after-action narrative. The forced landing had been planned. The oil pressure problem had been faked. Thibodaux was supposed to set the airplane down in the paddy, watch Harlan walk away to his contact, and then be picked up by the rescue helicopters that had been pre-positioned only minutes away. 46 minutes was a long time in combat search and rescue terms. The helicopters had taken too long, deliberately, to give Harlan time to clear the area. But Weems said, his voice quiet, the contact was not the contact. The man waiting in the rice paddy had not been the friendly that Harlan was supposed to meet. Somebody, somewhere along the chain, had been turned. The whole operation had been compromised before it ever left Ben Hoa. The men who killed Harlan had also killed Thibodaux. They had cut the fuel lines on the Skyraider so that no one could fly it out. Then they had killed the pilot in the cockpit, in a way that left no obvious trauma, possibly with a garrote, possibly by suffocation, possibly by holding his head under the muddy water. Then they had stripped the airplane of certain documents Harlan had been carrying, walked the body of the intelligence officer 20 meters away, executed him to make sure, and disappeared into the canals before the helicopters arrived overhead. The rescue crews, Weems said, had landed 46 minutes after Thibodaux's airplane went down. They had searched the area for 3 hours. They had found nothing. The Skyraider, sitting in the middle of an open paddy, was already gone. The local farmers, who in the chaos of those years took their orders from whichever side had men with guns nearest to them, had been paid or threatened to drag the wreckage into a deeper section of paddy and bury it. By the next morning, there was no airplane, no body, no story. Just a missing in action report filed by a wingman who had been told in clear and specific terms what he could and could not say. Murchison asked Weems who had told him what he could and could not say. Weems looked out the kitchen window for a long time. A child somewhere in the neighborhood was learning to ride a bicycle. The leaf blower had stopped. Weems said that the man who had told him had not given a name. Weems had been called into a small office at Bien Hoa the day after the loss. The man had been a civilian, mid-40s, gray suit, Southern accent. He had told Weems that he was sorry for his loss, that Roy Thibodaux had been a fine officer, and that the official story would be that the Skyraider had crashed into the river. The man had told Weems that the alternative, asking questions, would not bring his friend back, would not help his friend's family, and would have consequences for Curtis Weems that Curtis Weems would not enjoy. Weems had been 28 years old. He had a wife and an infant son back in Georgia. He had filed the report he was told to file. He looked at Murchison across the kitchen table. He said, very softly, that he had been waiting all his life to tell somebody. The document arrived in a brown manila envelope at Murchison's office at Hickam in the second week of August 2005. There was no return address. The postmark was Arlington, Virginia. The accompanying letter was unsigned and consisted of a single typed sentence. "You did not get this from me." Inside were 23 pages of what appeared to be a partially declassified after-action review of a covert program designated Project Driftwood, dated initially in the autumn of 1966 and amended through the spring of 1968. Approximately 40% of the text was redacted, blacked out with the heavy uniform bars of formal government security review. Pages 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the original document were not included. They were marked on the page index as missing from archive. The remaining pages had been photocopied multiple times. The copies were grainy, The text in places was barely legible, but it was enough. Project Driftwood had been a joint Central Intelligence Agency and Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group operation conducted between late 1965 and early 1968. Its purpose, as far as Murchison could determine from the unredacted portions of the document, had been the recruitment, handling, and extraction of human intelligence assets operating inside the political and military command structure of the National Liberation Front, the political wing of the Viet Cong in the western Mekong Delta. The program had run approximately 14 assets over its 2.5 years of operation, of whom 7 had been successfully exfiltrated, 4 had disappeared and were presumed killed. 1 had defected back to the other side and was understood to have done so, and 2 had died during extraction attempts. Marcus Theodore Harlan was not named in the unredacted portions of the document, but there were references to an asset code-named Scrivener, who had been operating since the spring of 1966 in the political infrastructure of the Western Delta, who had provided information of, the document said, exceptional quality and historical significance, and who had been scheduled for emergency extraction on the day Roy Thibodaux' Skyraider had gone down. The extraction had failed. Scrivener was listed on a redacted line as status terminated, possible compromise. Murchison read the document twice on the first night. He read it again on the second night. The third time he read it, he noticed something he had missed. In a paragraph describing the security protocols for the extraction, the document referenced a small, hand-carried packet of materials that Scrivener was to bring with him. The packet was described, in the unredacted text, as containing, quote, names and operational details concerning indigenous personnel of penetration value, end quote. The phrase indigenous personnel of penetration value was a CIA term of art. It referred to enemy assets, agents, operatives. It referred to a list of human beings, on the other side, who had been turned. A list of double agents. If Scrivener had been carrying a list of double agents working for the United States inside the Viet Cong, and if Scrivener had been killed by men who had been waiting for him at the extraction site, then those men had been the enemy. And those men now had the list. They knew which of their own people had been turned, and they would be moving, in the days and weeks after the failed extraction, to round up every one of those double agents and execute them. Murchison sat at his desk and added it up in his head. 14 assets in Project Driftwood. 7 extracted. 4 disappeared. 1 defected. 2 killed during extraction. The last entry in the document, on its second-to-last unredacted page, was a final program assessment written in the spring of 1968. Following loss of asset Scrivener and apparent compromise of asset list, agency has lost contact with the remainder of the network. All remaining assets are presumed eliminated. Recommendation: terminate program. Recommendation accepted. End of program. The program had not ended because the war had moved on. The program had ended because the Viet Cong had killed everyone in it. And it had ended because Roy Thibodaux' Skyraider had been compromised before it ever took off. Somebody in the chain of command, somebody who had known the time and place and method of Scrivener's extraction, had given that information to the other side. Somebody on the American side. Somebody in the very small circle of men who had access to Project Driftwood's operational details. The list of those men, the document indicated on its final page, had numbered 11. 11 officers and civilians who had known where Scrivener would be on the morning Thibodaux' Skyraider landed in that paddy. The names of those 11 men were redacted, every one of them. Black bars all the way down the page. Murchison stared at the redacted list for a very long time. The gut-punch revelation, the thing that reframed everything, was not that there had been a traitor inside Project Driftwood. Traitors happened in every war. The gut punch was this. The Skyraider's fuel lines had been cut after landing. Roy Thibodaux had been killed in the cockpit. Scrivener had been executed and buried. But the wingman, Curtis Weems, had been allowed to fly home and live a long, quiet life in Beaumont, Texas. And Curtis Weems, alone of every American directly connected to Project Driftwood's final extraction, had survived. If somebody on the American side had compromised the operation, and if that somebody had wanted to make sure no Americans came home alive to ask questions, then Curtis Weems should have died too. He should have been shot down on his own way home. He should have had a maintenance accident on his next mission. He should have been killed in some quiet way that would never be questioned. But he had not. He had been allowed to live. Which meant, Murchison realized, with a slow, cold certainty that began somewhere in his lower spine and crawled up to the back of his neck, that Curtis Weems had been useful to whoever had betrayed Project Driftwood. Which meant, in turn, that the man Murchison had been talking with for 6 hours over iced tea in a Beaumont kitchen, the man who had said he had been waiting all his life to tell somebody, might not have been telling him the whole truth. He might not have been telling him any of the truth. He might have been telling him exactly what someone had told him 38 years ago to say if anyone ever came asking. The metallurgy report, prepared by a contract laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio in late September of 2005, ran to 17 pages. Most of it was technical. The summary on the first page was not. The 2 segments of fuel line recovered from the wreckage of the A-1H Skyraider, designated as Hobo 2, were aluminum, 3/4-inch nominal diameter, original manufacturer specification, consistent with United States Navy supply. Each segment showed a single transverse cut, made by a sharp-edged tool, the cut surfaces displaying the characteristic shearing pattern of a heavy blade impacting a stationary tube against a hard backing surface. Microscopic examination of the cut faces revealed trace deposits of carbon steel, indicating that the cutting tool had been made of high-carbon steel, possibly a military-issue knife or bayonet of either American or Soviet bloc manufacture. The cuts were estimated to have been made by a single tool, in a single session, with a strike force consistent with manual application. In other words, somebody had cut the fuel lines by hand with a knife while standing inside the engine compartment of the Skyraider. Murchison sat in his office at Hickam in the late afternoon, with the trade winds blowing through the open window and the report spread across his desk, and he thought through the sequence again. Roy Thibodaux had set the Skyraider down in the paddy at approximately 0830 hours. Curtis Weems had begun his orbit overhead. Within minutes of landing, somebody on the ground had reached the aircraft. They had opened the canopy. They had killed Thibodaux in a manner that left no skeletal trauma. They had then opened the engine cowling and severed the fuel lines, ensuring that even if the aircraft were somehow recovered or moved, it could not be flown out and would not yield useful evidence about its actual fuel state at the time of landing. They had then intercepted Scrivener, who had been walking west, carrying the asset packet and the false dog tags identifying him as M.T. Harlan. They had bound him, walked him a short distance, taken the packet, and shot him in the back of the head. They had buried him in a dike. The locals had been instructed to bury the airplane in the next paddy and forget what they had seen. 46 minutes after Thibodaux had landed, the rescue helicopters had arrived to find an empty rice paddy and a missing pilot. The whole operation on the ground had taken less than 30 minutes. It had been performed by men who knew exactly what they were doing, who had been waiting for Thibodaux's airplane to land at that specific paddy, and who had brought with them the tools and the manpower required for a precise and silent execution. This was not a Viet Cong ambush. This was a black operation, conducted by professionals against an American intelligence asset and the pilot who had inadvertently delivered him into the kill zone. The question was who? Murchison did what he had been trained to do. He worked the list. 11 men, according to the redacted Project Driftwood document, had known the operational details of Scrivener's extraction. 11 names, all blacked out. He could not see them, but he could deduce some of them. 2 of them had to have been the operations officer at Bien Hoa, a major whose name appeared in unredacted form elsewhere in the squadron's files, and the squadron commander who had signed the verbal frag order. He pulled both men's records. The major had retired in 1973 at the rank of lieutenant colonel and had died of a heart attack in 1989 in Tucson, Arizona. The squadron commander had retired in 1975 at the rank of full colonel and had died in a small aircraft crash in 1978 in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The crash had been ruled pilot error. The wreckage had been recovered. The body had been identified. A small aircraft crash. Murchison wrote the words down in his notebook and stared at them. He kept working the list. The CIA station chief in Saigon during the relevant period had been a man named, in the unredacted footnotes of the Project Driftwood document, only as the chief of station. His name was not given. Murchison knew from his old contacts who the man had been, but the man had died of pancreatic cancer in the late 1980s. The deputy chief, who had run the asset program directly, had retired from the agency in 1971, gone to work for a private security consulting firm in Northern Virginia, and had been killed in a hit-and-run accident in 1983. The driver had never been identified. The case had been closed without resolution. 3 deaths: a heart attack, a small plane crash, a hit-and-run, spread across more than 15 years, each one explainable on its own. Each one, in the context of the others, the kind of pattern that any investigator with experience in Cold War intelligence work began to recognize. Somebody, over a period of years, had been quietly cleaning up the witnesses to Project Driftwood. The men who had known about Scrivener's extraction, the men whose names had once been on that redacted list of 11, were nearly all dead. Some by what looked like natural causes, some by what looked like accidents. But not all of them. Curtis Weems was still alive. Murchison was still alive. And one other person, Murchison realized as he flipped back through his notes, was still alive too. The deputy operations officer of the 1st Special Operations Squadron in 1967, a young captain who had been responsible for relaying the verbal frag order to the pilots that morning. His name had been Glenn Hargrove. Murchison sat very still at his desk. Glenn Hargrove was the forensic anthropologist who had been running the dig at the Tam Bin site. Glenn Hargrove had been the man who had told him about the cut fuel lines. Glenn Hargrove had been the man who had found the second skeleton. The world tilted slightly. Murchison stood up, walked to the window, and put his hand against the glass to steady himself. Outside, the runway shimmered in the afternoon heat. A KC-135 was in the pattern. The trade winds were pushing the palm trees on the perimeter. Somewhere, very far away, a man named Curtis Weems was sitting on a porch in Beaumont, Texas, drinking iced tea, waiting for the next call. There were 2 possibilities. Either Glenn Hargrove had spent his whole career in forensic anthropology because he had been atoning for something he did at 25, or Glenn Hargrove had been placed at this dig, on this case, because somebody, somewhere, was still managing the cleanup of Project Driftwood and wanted to know what Murchison was finding before Murchison did. Murchison did not know which it was. He did not know how to find out. And he had a sudden, very clear understanding that finding out might be the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Marie Thibodaux LeBlanc was 81 years old in the autumn of 2005. She lived in a small white house in the town of Houma, Louisiana, on a corner lot shaded by 2 enormous live oaks that had been there since before the Civil War. She had been Roy Thibodaux's older sister. She had outlived her parents, her younger sister, her husband of 53 years, and the brother whose photograph hung in a silver frame on her sideboard. Murchison drove down from Hickam by way of New Orleans on the 2nd weekend of October. He had called ahead. Marie had been expecting him. She met him at the door in a blue cotton dress, her white hair pulled back, her dark eyes still sharp behind a pair of reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She invited him into a parlor that smelled of beeswax furniture polish and the faint sweetness of pralines cooling somewhere in the kitchen. She poured coffee from a silver pot. She asked him to call her Marie. She had been told 3 months earlier that her brother's remains had been recovered and identified. She had been told that the burial would be at Arlington, with full honors, and that the United States government would arrange transportation for any family members who wished to attend. She had been told that the case file had been closed, that her brother had died in the line of duty, that he had been a good officer, and that his country was grateful. She had not been told the details. The DPAA had not shared the existence of the second skeleton, the cut fuel lines, the false dog tags, or the partially redacted file on Project Driftwood. None of that was in the family notification. Murchison sat in her parlor and tried to decide how much of it she deserved to hear. In the end, he told her almost everything. He told her about the cut fuel lines. He told her about the second man. He told her that there had been a covert program, that her brother had been pulled into it without his full knowledge, that the program had been compromised, and that the men who killed her brother had not been the enemy in the way that history had recorded the enemy. He told her what he could, and he told her what he suspected, and he told her more than once that he was sorry. Marie listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she sat for a long time with her coffee cup in her hands. The cup did not shake. She had been a Cajun woman in the salt marshes of South Louisiana for 81 years, and she had buried her parents and her sister and her husband, and she did not flinch easily. She said, finally, that she had something for him. She left the parlor and came back with a small wooden box, the kind a young person might use for treasures. She set it on the coffee table between them and opened it. Inside were perhaps 20 letters, the airmail kind with the red and blue striped borders, each one in a worn envelope, each one addressed in the same careful handwriting to Marie at her parents' house in Houma. Roy Thibodaux had written his sister every 2 weeks during his entire tour in Vietnam. The letters were arranged in chronological order. Marie pulled out the last one, the one with the latest postmark. She handed it to Murchison. The letter was dated 3 days before Roy Thibodaux's last flight. It was 4 pages long. It described the squadron, the heat, a meal of catfish and rice that one of the Vietnamese cooks had made him that reminded him of home. It asked about Marie's children, about their parents' health, about the shrimp catch. It said that he was tired but well, that he loved her, that he would be home soon. The last paragraph was different. Marie, Roy had written, in case anything happens to me on this next one, I need to tell you something. There is a man here who is not who he says he is. He is American, but he works for someone outside the regular service. I have been asked to fly him somewhere on a mission that does not feel right. The orders are wrong. The radios are wrong. The man does not look at people the way an officer looks at people. If I do not come home from this, please remember that name. Tell it to Father Boudreau at the cathedral. Tell him to send it to the senator from Louisiana, the one our father knew, with a note that says only that this man was not what he claimed to be and that he was at Ben Hoa in the spring of 1967. The name is Hargrove, Glenn Hargrove. He is a captain in operations, but I am almost certain that is not what he actually does. Marie, I love you. I will be home soon. Murchison read the paragraph 3 times. The words on the page did not change. Marie was watching him. She told him, in a quiet, flat voice, that she had received the letter 4 days after she had received the telegram informing the family that Roy was missing in action. She had not known what to do with it. She had been 23 years old. She had asked her father what to do. Her father had told her to put the letter away and never speak of it. Her father had said that her brother was already gone, and that whatever Roy had been mixed up in was bigger than them, and that going to a senator would only bring trouble onto the family. Her father had been a shrimp boat captain in Terrebonne Parish, and he had known the limits of the world he lived in, and he had told her to put the letter in the box and close the lid. She had done as he told her, for 38 years. She looked at Murchison with her dark, sharp eyes. She said that she understood now why he had come. She said that she did not know if she had been right or wrong to keep the letter all these years. She said that she had prayed about it more times than she could count, and that the answer she had received was always the same, which was that the letter was not hers to throw away. She had been keeping it for somebody. She thought that somebody was him. She handed Murchison the letter. She told him to take it. She told him to do with it what her brother had asked, as much as he could, as much as the world would allow. Murchison sat with the letter in his hands. The room was very quiet. Outside, a wind was moving in the live oaks. Somewhere in the kitchen, a clock was ticking. He could hear his own breath. He could hear, inside himself, the slow turning over of everything he had thought he understood about the case. Glenn Hargrove had been at Benoit in the spring of 1967. Glenn Hargrove had been on that redacted list of 11 men who had known about Scrivener's extraction. Glenn Hargrove had spent the next 38 years building a forensic anthropology career so distinguished that he had been the natural choice to run the dig at Tam Bin. Glenn Hargrove had been the man who had pointed out the cut fuel lines, who had found the second skeleton, who had walked Murchison through the entire site as if he were seeing it for the first time. But Glenn Hargrove had not been seeing it for the first time. He had been seeing it again. He had stood in that paddy 38 years earlier in a green flight suit or a black uniform, holding a knife or a pistol. He had been one of the men who had killed Roy Thibodaux, and he had spent his entire subsequent career making sure that if anyone ever came back to ask, he would be the man who told them what to find. The official report, filed by the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency in February of 2006, ran to 147 pages. It identified the skeletal remains recovered from the Tam Bin paddy as those of First Lieutenant Roy Joseph Thibodaux, United States Air Force, missing in action since the spring of 1967. It noted the unusual condition of the wreckage, including the irregular damage to the fuel system, which was described as consistent with severe ground impact in a controlled crash landing. It identified the second set of remains as those of an unknown male, Caucasian, age and origin undetermined, who was hypothesized to have been a Vietnamese collaborator with the South Vietnamese government, possibly executed by Viet Cong forces in the days following the crash. The dog tags found with the second body were assessed as field improvised, of unverifiable provenance, and their associated name as without identifiable referent in any United States military record. The report was accepted. It was filed. It was distributed to the appropriate offices. It was, in the polished and economical language of government bureaucracy, a closed case. Roy Thibodaux was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on a clear morning in the early spring of 2006. Marie LeBlanc and her 2 grown children attended. There was a flag-draped coffin, a 21-gun salute, the slow folding of the flag, and its presentation to Marie. A young chaplain spoke briefly. The honor guard moved with the precision that always made Murchison's throat close, no matter how many of these he attended. Curtis Weems was there too, in a wheelchair, with an oxygen tube in his nose. He had taken a turn for the worse in the autumn. He met Marie afterward, took her hand, and told her that her brother had been the best stick-and-rudder pilot he had ever flown with. Marie thanked him. She did not ask him any questions. Glenn Hargrove was not at the funeral. He had retired 3 weeks before the report was filed, citing health reasons, and had moved to a small property in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina. The forwarding address he left was a post office box. He did not return phone calls. Murchison filed the official report because his contract with the DPAA required him to file it, and because he had not been able to prove, to a legal standard, any of what he had come to suspect. The Roy Thibodaux letter was a single piece of paper, written by a frightened 25-year-old to his sister, naming a man on the basis of intuition. It was not evidence. The redacted Project Driftwood document had arrived in an unmarked envelope from an anonymous source and could not be authenticated. The death of the squadron commander in a small plane crash in the Sierra Nevadas was 30 years old, and the case had been closed at the time. The hit-and-run in Northern Virginia was 22 years old. The trail of dead witnesses was a pattern, and patterns were not proof. Murchison wrote a separate, classified addendum to the report, which he submitted through restricted channels to the Inspector General of the Department of Defense and to a single contact at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The addendum laid out everything he suspected. He never received a response from either office. The classification level of the addendum was raised twice, and the document was eventually withdrawn from circulation, accessible only to a small list of named individuals whose names Murchison was not on. He flew back to Vietnam in the spring of 2006. He told himself it was personal. He stood on the dike at the edge of the paddy outside Tam Bin, alone, in the late afternoon, with a cold wind moving across the green water and the sound of a transistor radio drifting from the village. The paddy had been replanted. Where the Skyraider had been pulled out of the mud, there was now nothing but young rice shoots, an electric green against the brown water. The dike where the second man had been buried had been rebuilt. There was no marker. There was no record. There was nothing to indicate that any of it had ever happened. The water buffalo that had refused to take another step on that morning in 2005 had died, the farmer told him, the previous autumn of natural causes. Had buried it at the edge of the paddy. He had not asked the buffalo what it had known. He had not believed that it had known anything. Murchison stood there for a long time. He thought about Roy Thibodaux, 25 years old, alone in a cockpit in the moments after a forced landing, looking out through a canopy at the wide green delta, and not yet understanding that the men running toward his airplane were not coming to help him. He thought about Scrivener, walking west through a rice paddy with a packet of names in his coat, expecting a contact who was not the contact he expected. He thought about Curtis Weems, orbiting overhead in a Skyraider, watching a man in black walk away from his friend's airplane, knowing already that he was being asked to participate in a lie that he would carry for the rest of his life. He thought about Glenn Hargrove. He thought about him for a long time. Then he drove back to Ho Chi Minh City. He flew home. He turned in his contract paperwork. He retired for the second time in the summer of 2006. He bought a small house in Pensacola, Florida, near the air station where he had begun his career as an enlisted aviation electronics technician in 1970. He started fishing again. He stopped reading the newspapers. His phone rang one evening in the late autumn of 2007. He was sitting on his porch. The number on the caller ID was blocked. He knew, in the way that men who have done this work for 30 years come to know, exactly who was on the other end. He let it ring 4 times, then 5, then 6. He did not pick up. He sat on the porch and listened to the phone ring. It rang 12 times. Then it stopped. He did not know whether the silence that followed meant that he had won, or whether it meant that whoever was on the other end had simply made a note in a file and moved on to the next item of business. He did not know whether the call would come again. He did not know whether there would come a morning, eventually, when he would not wake up, and the local police would call it a stroke, or a heart attack, or a fall in the bathroom, and the file on Project Driftwood would close, finally, for the last time. He sat on his porch in the dark, and he watched the lightning over the Gulf, and he listened to the silence, and he thought about a young pilot from Houma, Louisiana, who had set a Skyraider down in a green paddy on a hot morning 39 years before, and who had stepped out into the mud believing, for one last moment, that he was being rescued. The phone, on the small table beside him, stayed silent. He never knew, in the end, whether that was a mercy or a warning.